Excellent. All right. Cool. Thank you, Paul. Cheers. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much to the organisers, and thank you for all the speakers that came before me. A bit of pressure here to perform. So for disclosures of interest, that's a bit too far. These are my disclosures, and I believe I have no conflicts to declare. Before we dive in, I do want to set the scene a little bit. We have 10 undergraduate registrations for this presentation, so welcome. Great that you're coming. And so I'll be spending a minute sort of talking about the data context before I start presenting a lot of numbers, much more than means. So the bigger picture, I'm really interested in the bigger picture informed by an evidence base derived from multiple ways to consider the same subject, such as wire through the use of different study designs. For a dietary exposure such as fibre, I'm interested in the broad strokes findings, which come from cohort studies or prospective studies looking at higher and lower intakes against hard outcomes such as the non-communicable diseases and mortality. I'm interested in the intervention trials of changing intakes when compared to something like usual care. And I'm interested in the mechanistic work to consider an action or response within the body in the presence of fibre. So each building block there tells a story in its own. And if you see consistency between those building blocks, you become more certain or more confident that you understand what's going on, moving towards causality. My job today is to present the prospective cohort data, specifically meta-analyses, as these data lend themselves really well to being combined together, as does the trial data. Jim will cover a lot of the trial work within the context of diabetes management, and then John and Michael will present the mechanistic work. Most importantly, after the break, Lisa's going to look at sort of what do we currently have in our diet and how do we move towards what we should be having or could be having, because all these numbers and these things that I show you don't mean anything without translation into practice. So, very quickly, cohorts are groups of people, the same people followed over time. There is no intervention. These are observational studies. So results of studies on their own only report about associations between an exposure and an outcome. We have a cohort study here in Dunedin. It's a birth cohort of 1,000 children that are now followed all the way up to age 45. But most other cohorts sort of recruit adults, and they follow adults across the time span towards the end. I've just realized you can't see my mouse on the screen. Okay. So the vast majority of cohorts actually report on tens and thousands to hundreds of thousands of people, and they can be followed for 3 years, for 10 years, for 20, up to around 42 years are some of the longest running cohorts. So quite a lot of data there. And what they do is they collect data at baseline about the exposures. They follow people up maybe every 2 or 5 years, and then at each time point they sort of analyze. And so the relationship changes the longer that the people are followed for. For the data relating to fibre, whole grains, vegetables, fruits and pulses, which I'll be presenting today, systematic searches of the published literature have identified cohorts that look at these exposures and non-communicable disease incidence and mortality from the countries in blue. We've got a lot of data from the USA, that country there, a lot of data from the European region. We have no data from India or that continent, Africa, or most of South America as well. Once identified, the results of each cohort are combined, when appropriate with meta-analyses, which are used to compare higher intakes with lower intakes, or dose-response associations across the intake spectrum, assuming linearity or not assuming linearity, and we'll look at that a little bit later. Results are presented as risk ratios, using the maximally adjusted effect sizes, and then we use meta-regression analysis to identify subgroups, and then further sensitivity analysis, such as influence analysis, publication bias, study quality, and cohort parameters. One of the large strengths of meta-analyses is that they can increase the generalizability of the findings by combining study and data from different places. However, bear in mind that the geographical spread that I'm going to present has some gaps in it. And then regarding the amount of data that we're talking about, there's 100 people in this room. The mean age might be 40. So that's around 4,000 years of person years if we were all followed from birth until now. We see quite a sliding scale. There's a lot of data, 95 million person years relating to dietary fiber. However, as we start to break that down into different fruits and vegetables or smaller categories, we're losing amounts of data, and therefore we're losing our confidence in what's going on and if that's generalizable across all situations. And we have very little data available for fiber from nuts and seeds. So this is the data as I'll mainly present it, and this is looking at dietary fiber exposure and all-cause mortality, or different types of mortality. When looking at higher versus lower, and this is the top left of the screen, you can see a 15% reduction in all-cause mortality for those having higher levels of fiber versus those having the lowest intakes of fiber. And as an absolute risk value, that translates to around 13 deaths per 1,000 participants for the course or duration of the studies that we followed. And that varies between 8 and 18 fewer deaths. I'm reporting CVD separately from CHD and stroke, and that's because I'm using what the papers that were identified in the systematic review define them as. So if they just talked about the broad bucket CVD, that goes into there. If they talk specifically about CHD or stroke, they go into those buckets, and they're not combined in any way. I'm treating them separately. You can see that there's less data available for stroke mortality, only 2 studies, and you can see those really wide confidence intervals where it's going to be something between a 50% decrease to a 15% increase in risk with higher intakes of fiber. So you can't say too much about that one because we don't have the data available. That's a higher versus lower analysis, and that's largely appropriate when you're using FFQs to sort of define your baseline exposure. Another more complex way to look at it maybe is with dose response analyses, which is the bottom table that I'll be showing for all of these. And you can see consistently for all-cause mortality, CVD, CHD, cancer, you've got both a higher versus lower finding and a dose response analysis because those confidence intervals don't cross 1. This picture takes a little bit of explaining as well too. This is the dose response modeled. The x-axis is the amount of fiber per day the participants of the studies had, and then the relative risk is the vertical axis. Things dropping below 1 are showing a decrease in risk. So for this one, you can see higher intakes of total fiber are associated with a decreased risk of all-cause mortality for that one. The red line is a restricted cubic spline model that doesn't assume it's in a linear association. I'm showing you the blue line because that is assuming a linear association, and I'm showing you the confidence intervals about the red line, so those are the dashy lines. And then I'm also putting circles on top of it because I want to show you how much data was involved in it, where the data points were in regards to dose and what they were saying. So these are each of the quantiles of the studies identified for this association. That's quite complex, but we'll see a couple of them. In short, this one shows that increasing intakes of fiber, there's a dose-response relationship with reduced all-cause mortality. For cardiovascular disease, and this is incidence, not necessarily that derived into a mortality, we see quite a similar picture for CVD and CHD, and we see that we have more data available for stroke. So while we only had 2 studies reporting stroke mortality, we have 9 studies for stroke incidence, and then you start seeing some beneficial effects with an 18% decrease there with higher intakes of fiber compared with lower intakes. The dose response is also consistent for the incidence of CVD, CHD, and stroke, so that's all nice and straightforward. But the reason I wanted to show you this is why assuming linearity or not assuming linearity is useful. The blue line assumes there's a linear association, so if you plotted off that, you're looking at ongoing benefits down to around a 40% reduction at 35 grams of fiber. However, the more flexible model, the red one, is showing more of a plateau. So initial benefits when going from low to moderate intakes, but with the data available, it doesn't indicate further benefits when moving from moderate to high intakes. So you've got to consider both when you can with the data. Type 2 diabetes, very clearly associated. Higher intakes of dietary fiber were associated with lower intakes of lower prevalence or incidence of type 2 diabetes. And as far as absolute risks, that results in 12 fewer incidents per 1,000 participants over the duration of the studies, ranging from between 8 to 17 cases per 1,000. That's the confidence intervals. Very clear. And then the adiposity-related cancers. So higher versus lower and dose-response associations identified benefits of higher fiber intakes for breast cancer and for colorectal cancer. There wasn't a lot that could be said about the other cancer types because there was limited data, And so they're a little bit inconclusive, and the evidence for them is quite weak in any direction. These cancers occur less frequently than CVD and type 2 diabetes, so the absolute risk values aren't as high, while the percentages for colorectal cancer, that's a 16% decrease as a relative risk, it only translates to 2 or 3 less cases per 1,000 participants, just because that occurs less as an NCD. And then I'm showing you that picture there, which is also colorectal cancer, because it's the biggest one that we had available. This involves 21 million person years. You can see it's quite linear, and it's quite regular, because of all the data points that are informing the shape of the relationship. So that's the data available for prospective studies on total fibre intake, with higher intakes associated with increased CVD, CHD, mortality, diabetes, and cancers occurrence. Another way to consider the information is relative to the New Zealand population. And our median intake here, using 0809 data, is 19.6 grams. So half of us consume less than that, and half of us consume more. But dietary targets start at 25 grams a day. So regardless of where you are on the spectrum, you can see an ongoing decrease in risk, and this is just all-cause mortality when we considered all those other conditions as well. So there would be a viable risk reduction in a range of diseases we had covered when moving from lower to higher intakes, and that would be relevant to New Zealand and health costs and all those other ongoing things. And that's fibre as a nutrient. We could also consider sources of fibre in our diet, so more looking at the foods, not the fibre they contain. And using 0809 ANS data, the largest contributor of fibre in the New Zealand diet was bread, of which 60 to 65% was whole grain. Whole grain foods are promoted currently in the eating and physical activity recommendations in New Zealand, and with advice to have mostly whole grains or to replace refined with whole grains. This is all the data all at once. There was slightly less data available for whole grains than dietary fibre. However, quite consistently, you can see benefits and reductions in everything on the left, apart from stroke incidence and prostate cancer. Some of these benefits actually look to be a little bit better than dietary fibre. If you look at the type 2 diabetes, the higher versus lower, it's a 33% reduction, which is quite incredible. That's incidence. It's specified mortality in the top 5 of the rows, and then everything after is incidence. And so what do they translate to? All-cause mortality, absolute risk of 26 fewer deaths per 1,000 participants, ranging between 14 and 39. And then for type 2 diabetes, that's 13 less cases of diabetes per 1,000 participants. These are serious numbers and very consistent across the number of non-communicable disease outcomes we saw. At the time we did our search, the information was not available to consider breast, endometrial, or esophageal cancers. However, my student Chris is doing an excellent job on a meta-analysis for grain intakes and breast cancer incidence and mortality, so watch that space. And then another source of fibre in the New Zealand diet is, of course, vegetables, starchy vegetables and fruit, which when you combine them account for around 40% of fibre intakes in New Zealand. And the current eating and activity guidelines recommend consuming plenty of vegetables and fruit. To summarise these three, higher intakes of fruit and vegetables are also associated with a reduced risk of mortality and non-communicable diseases. The benefits from fruit and vegetables for these outcomes do not plateau. They were seen all the way up to 900 grams a day, which was the highest intakes recorded. The benefits from fruits and vegetables for these outcomes, like I said, did not plateau, and higher levels confirmed greater benefits. I'm not showing you the all cancer, which did actually have a plateau above 500 grams. We didn't identify any benefits beyond that. And then this is also supported by the controlled trials of increasing fruit and vegetable intake, showing statistically significant changes in body weight. So, from the ANS data again, only 41% of New Zealanders consume their 3 serves of vegetables and 2 serves of fruit every day, which equates to around 400 grams. That data is 10 years old, and so it might not reflect current New Zealand populations. So what I'm looking at is the global average of fruit and vegetable intake, a weighted mean of 210 grams. And you can do some sort of projective modeling to look at what does it look like if the population shifted towards 400 grams. And if that was the average, that average person would have a mean reduction of 8% in all-cause mortality, and 6.6% reduction in CHD, 9% reduction in stroke, and a 5.2 reduction in cancer recurrence. People who have less than that, and that's 50% of people in the world, would have greater reductions in those from consuming higher levels of fruit and vegetable intake. What about potatoes? Hands up if you think potato or consider potato as a vegetable. Yeah, good. Anyone want to say that potato might not be a vegetable or shouldn't be considered in the same category? You've already looked at the data on the slide, haven't you? Okay, I should have thought that one out. They're not always included as vegetables in dietary guidelines and recommendations. Starchy vegetables are not always removed, so it's good to look at them in isolation. Especially considering that they're the traditional component of diets in the South Pacific, in Ireland, in Eastern Europe, as well as South America. So this is data from a 2018 systematic review and meta-analysis on the available cohort data. And it's looking at all potato intake on the x-axis, and then it's considering but not finding any association using those restricted splines, the more flexible model. For all-cause mortality, coronary heart disease, stroke, and colorectal cancer, none of these higher intakes of potatoes were not associated with an increased risk of any of these. They did see some type 2 diabetes and hypertension increase in risk. However, if you do a meta-regression on the results, you see that's actually driven by the French fries that are being consumed. So there's lots of nods in the audience. This makes common sense. The protective benefits were actually seen from the boiled and roasted potatoes, and then more detrimental was seen from the French fries, which are fried, so they have extra energy, as well as added salt, which probably really nicely explains the hypertension story there. So what this evidence probably suggests, obviously, is it's actually the cooking and preparation method. That's really important in potato intake, and the potato might just be a potential vehicle for the added sodium, saturated fats, and excess energy. There's not a lot of trials in this area. This is, once again, just one part of the story, cohort data, but there's not many trials of increasing starchy vegetable intake while controlling for those added sodiums or fats. That would be really interesting to see what the data from those would look like. And then I just have a note from a practical perspective, you get more fibre when you leave the skin on. So if you're not already considering that, please do. The last group we're going to look at is pulse as a source of fibre, and New Zealand doesn't have much of a pulse consumption. Lisa's work on intervention trials around the world indicated increasing pulse intakes improved decreased LDL and total cholesterol, which might explain some of the associations with CHD and CVD. There wasn't too much with stroke, and then the data on type 2 suggested there might be a benefit for higher pulse intakes, chickpeas, beans. However, it was quite vulnerable data, integrity issues, so I'm not going to show that. All right, strengths of what we've just looked at, and I understand that was a lot of numbers all at once, so I'm sorry for that. But cohorts are followed long enough for non-communicable disease occurrence or mortality to occur. We can't often do that with trials because you have to follow too many people for too long. So cohorts are somewhat useful for that picture. They can be really large. They can be suitably meta-analyzed when they have common exposures and outcomes, which enables a greater consideration of what else might be driving the observed results. Is it relative to the baseline fibre intake? Is it because of this cohort might have these characteristics while this one might have others? And then what we're always moving towards, and what we'll be discussing today, is the complementarity between mechanistic studies, trials of increasing intakes and cohorts following people over time to enable that sort of causal inference relative to higher fibre intakes. Because these are observational studies, or actually all trial designs have weaknesses, so they're always worth acknowledging. And that is that what we've looked at is one nutrient and then some food sources that contain the nutrient. What we can't control or really consider is the interactions when we start moving into dietary patterns, which are many foods, and then how dietary patterns fit within the lifestyle. And that's sort of the smoking story and other things that came up earlier today. So there's always going to be that caveat when looking at nutrients or just foods. There's residual confounding. So while we try and control, and we used estimates that controlled for things like smoking, for BMI, for age, and the most maximally adjusted, there's always going to be some residual stuff or things that we can't encounter or control for. So we must acknowledge that. We didn't have data from all countries or regions, as I showed you with a map. And this evidence, just considered by itself, just talks about associations, not causality. And so where to from here? More data, I guess, on more intakes. The Southeast Asia is really interesting because they have low fibre intakes, and we don't have a lot of studies with lower fibre intakes and looking at the range within those countries. So that would be fantastic to see more of this cohort data. Considering markers of carbohydrate quality with the overall dietary load of carbohydrates, not many people are doing that. A lot of the story at the moment is about the amount of carbohydrates without considering the quality, which is really quite misleading and maybe one-dimensional. However, how do we incorporate quality into also the amount? Is a high fibre, high carbohydrate diet as good as a high fibre, moderate carbohydrate diet? Are there differences there? Reducing barriers to increasing fibre, whole grain, vegetable, whole fruit and legume intakes is more of the translational work. Because while I sit behind a desk and I just play with numbers, I recognise the importance of social media and influencers, obviously, in changing that narrative towards considering those appropriate or evidence-based markers of carbohydrate quality, so that the message in the community is more straightforward and maybe aligned with what we observe for health outcomes. This is just confirming all the associations we saw about high fibre intakes, high fruit and vegetable, high whole grains, being associated with a lot of those non-communicable disease incidences. And then my concluding statement is based on the best available data, New Zealanders don't eat enough fibre, whole grains, vegetables or fruit. And that's from 2008, 2009. Population increase in the consumption of these foods would reduce the burden of disease here in New Zealand, as it would in many other countries. And then what we know about dietary intakes in New Zealand is already 10 years old, so it's kind of hard to know, given that we understand the food supply has changed over that time. That's all I've got. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and I'll open the floor to questions or comments. Don't see any hands there.
John.
Andrew, I'll just ask one and then I'll go to John.
Yep.
You mentioned fibre and the
did.
correlation with these non-communicable diseases. How is fibre determined in these studies?
Yeah, a complete range. So there's different methodologies, obviously, to measure the amount of fibre in food, and there's different changes over the last 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years on how we change and what is included in the definition of fibre, which John touched on. Because we're accepting a large range of studies, up to 30 in one analysis, there are differences between them, as are there differences between how that data was identified from the food source, FFQ, diet history, diet record, as well as other things as how they reported incidents. So there's a lot of variability within the data, as well as how it's measured. That's why most of those comparisons are the highest intakes versus the lowest intakes with the group. Because even if that's shifting slightly across the scale, you're still looking at higher consumers versus lower. And then when you drill down and you look at the dose response, when you do care about the exact numbers of fibre intake, because of an FFQ isn't often a great provider of the exact amount of fibre people are having, it's a ranking tool, you have to use some statistical methodology such as restricted splines, which sort of force the data through certain points, which accounts for some of that.
I think it's not only the different chemical forms of fibre, but all those different chemical forms have different physical properties,
Yep.
which are no doubt also related to these diseases. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to disentangle this, and this is a great start.